Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, I'm Layman Pascal, and welcome back to the Integral Stages author series, where today we're going to get our donkeys facing in the same direction with Robert M. Ellis. Robert and I share a passion for philosophically unpacking non-dualism in ways that pertain to moral development, human well-being, ecology, and all kinds of practical functional contexts. So perhaps we'll get into that and into his work extending and generalizing principles of the so-called middle way, but we're going to start with heroes and shadows because the latest instantiation of Robert's one eternal book is called Archetypes in Religion and Beyond. Hello, Robert.
Hello, good to meet you, Layman.
First of all, where can our book-crazed viewers get their grubby little hands on this thing? What's the best place for them to buy
it? To buy Archetypes in Religion and Beyond, it's published by Equinox. And if you go to Equinox's website, then you can get it at a 25% discount by inputting ARCH as a code when you check out. So that's the cheapest place to get it. I would have thought, probably.
All right, perfect. Here's a tiny anecdote. When I was about 13, I started to read all these old Conan stories reprinted from the pulp magazines of the 1930s and 40s. And then I found that when I had to do physical chores for the family, particularly one time when we had to move a lot of gravel and had to do shoveling for hours for some landscaping on the property, Conan's physical suffering and toil popped into my mind. And I thought, well, if it's good enough for Conan, it's good enough for me. So I was able to interpolate a triumphant sensibility into my labors, which made them much easier and more interesting. So I'm assuming that's the kind of action that you mean by archetypes, but obviously different people mean a lot of different things by this word. And you've got a phrase to describe what you mean, which is diachronic schematic functions. So maybe you could unpack those three words for us so that we all know what we're talking about.
Okay. I mean, your example is a great lead-in because that's what I call the archetypal function of the hero, which is to inspire one to continue towards a goal in some way or another, even though eventually that goal may also change and the means of reaching it may change, but you still need perseverance even when the goal is flexible. So yeah, Conan popping into your head and inspiring you is exactly the kind of process I'm discussing in the book, which is about archetypes as functions, really. So it's asking what archetypes do, trying to take an overall practical view of them, or at least a view of them which is framed by practical needs in the end. And so, you want an explanation of that phrase. Well, the diachronic schematic functions is, I recognize, can be an off-puttingly technical sounding phrase, but basically if you just break down those three parts of it. So a function is what something does. So I'm interested in what archetypes do for us rather than what they ultimately are, which we can't necessarily answer, or at least I'd rather not get into the speculations that are often involved when people try and answer that. The schematic that brings in the whole question of embodied meaning and the relationship of archetypal meaning to the kind of account of meaning that Lakoff and Johnson have developed particularly. So the idea that archetypes are meaningful schemas, so a schema in embodied meaning terms is a kind of set of associations between experiences and symbols or words of some kind. So you could be talking about a good example is the container schema. So we've got all kinds of words for container, like field or bucket, for example, and we've got preposition like in or whatever, which depends on the idea of containment. So there's a set of meanings that go together there, which we gain an understanding of through association. So you can call container a schema because of that. That's one of the one of the examples used by Lakoff and Johnson. And so I'm suggesting that archetypes are schemas in the same way, because they, by association, for example, you might have an idea or a set of associations with the hero, which you then come back to at points where you need inspiration. So it has that function for you. because it has that set of associations. So it's a schematic function. And then the diachronic means over time. So you're coming back to those sources of inspiration at different points during your life, and thus integrating your experience and your goals and so on over time. So I think that talking about bringing and pulling ourselves together over time is for me, can substitute pretty much what Jung was trying to get at in the idea of the unconscious. Because how do we know about things that we believe to be unconscious? Well, because we've experienced them at one time or another, but they're removed over time. So it's another way of in a way talking about the same things I think Jung was trying to get at, without getting into possibly difficult or speculative constructions about what the unconscious is.
So this is an embodied, inactive set of associations from different parts of our experience that can perform a function for us and which we can periodically re-encounter. And when we're not encountering them, they're somewhere else, but it doesn't matter too much what that somewhere else is.
Exactly. Yep.
All right. It's interesting you bring up Jung, because one of the things I thought of in reading this book was the Jungian notion of enantiodromia, right? That things sort of can become their opposites in time. And it seems like that's part of the problem that archetypes, the way you're thinking about them, are meant to solve. And whether it's by the simple complexity of daily challenges and limited memory, or whether it's because of some inherent logic of the world that things reverse themselves, that if we want to steer ourselves in a world that's full of flips and changes and reprioritizations, that we need something that spans those contexts. Right? Do you think like archetypes are part of the means by which we adapt to longer spans of time and sort of evolve to occupy the evolutionary niche that's outside of our immediate moment?
Well, yeah, or it's outside a kind of limited identification in time. I mean, I think that might be the immediate moment, or it might be we can get obsessed with the past or the future as well. Absolutize that, to use a phrase that I use in my other work. I think that this tendency to get obsessed with one side of the duality and just getting caught up on the horns of that duality, can be addressed particularly by becoming more aware over time, by connecting together our awareness at different points in time. So archetypes are one way of doing that, because whatever, we may have great practices to try and engage ourselves in that, to integrate ourselves, but if we can't also keep inspiring ourselves to do those practices, then it's not going to make a lot of difference. So I see archetypes as a dimension almost of that integrative practice.
Nice. How would you distinguish archetypes from stereotypes?
Yes, I would. I mean, stereotypes are kind of biased. They're a way, an easy, quick way of making a judgment about something by assuming it's part of a particular category that is easy to relate to or find, and that category tells you the whole story. So archetypes are almost in a way helping us to do the reverse of that, I think, getting beyond that easy answer to how we should relate to something or how we should judge it, by inspiring us to work in the longer term and to engage with more complexity over time, to have a look at that object that we've pigeonholed again and think about it again from a slightly different angle.
The book is called Archetypes in Religion and Beyond. Is the beyond because archetypes are also at play in non-religious circumstances, or because really we should be thinking about religion as a much more general phenomenon that's not limited to people who think they're religious?
Both in a way. Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of accepting that there are conventional ways people use the term religion, and that's, well, I mean, Jung talked about religion as the expression of the archetypes, and so there's obviously a particular connection between what people have called religion and a particular focus on archetypal symbols, obviously particularly the God archetype, but also the other major archetypes. So I think the anima animus and the shadow also features in religion, and the hero. And you find those four functions, which I think are the key ones, in all the religions in different forms. But to go beyond that, I mean, the problem is, of course, that in the modern distinction between religion and secularity, or religion and non-religion, all those archetypes are also beyond religion as well as within it. So part of the point of the title was to direct people's attention beyond as well, and particularly to think about the way we use concepts like truth or nature or humanity, beauty, and a lot of rationality. That all of these I discuss in the book, right at the end of the book, because I think these also have archetypal functions for us, even though people tend to regard them as secular and they tend to think of them just conceptually rather than as images. But they are also images. They also have a rich symbolic value to them, and people can be inspired by them in the same way. So particularly, I mean, the idea of truth is a very good example, I think, because basically we don't have access to truth. I don't think we can't produce sets of propositions that say, well, that's absolutely true, that's definitely true, that set of words matches reality. But that at the same time, our commitment to truth is really important, and that's coming home to me more and more the more I see Putin's machinations at the moment. But so it makes total sense to me then to think of truth as an archetype, and that it's a really important function for human beings to connect to that archetype and to have a relationship with it, to continue to be inspired by it in their attempts to get better descriptions of what they have experienced, and to probe the conditions and to understand things better than they did before, even though they know they were never going to get to the end of that process, probably. That doesn't in any way diminish the importance of the archetype.
So you've got these four sort of key diachronic schematic functions, kind of the heroic protagonist, the unsettling shadow, the attractively polarized counterbalancing function, and the mysterious or apex power beyond our forms and ideas. And you've got these other ones, truth, nature. How are the other ones related to these core four? Do they ultimately boil down to those core four, or are they, the sprites and the Olympians? Are they different strata? How are they related?
I think that depends on their functions. So I think, in a sense, yes, they do boil down to those four, in the sense that they fulfill the functions of those four kinds. So I think of the hero as being about the full function of fulfilling goals, the anima animus being related to the other through relationship, the shadow responding to threats, and the God archetype is the biggest one, but it's engaging with unknown potential in one way or another. So primarily, I'd see truth and nature, for example, as being often symbols for the God archetype. So they're, in one way or another, we are engaging with unknown potential and reminding ourselves of our experience of engaging with unknown potential, even when things seem difficult, through concepts like truth and nature, quite often, depending on the traditions we work with and what we're personally inspired by, our personal histories and so on. So, if you're a scientist or maybe a journalist, you're trying to get at the truth, that may be well to be your version of the God archetype, because that's what's most important. That's what's driving you. That's what you're in relationship to as an ideal. But if you're engaged in ecological work, then nature is perhaps likely to be an archetypal form that's really important to you. But the function in each case, I would say, is similar to the function that God may have for theists, and that the Buddha may have for Buddhists, and so on. regardless of the theology or the specific philosophy of those terms as concepts.
Right. To use the kind of Hindu phrasing, right? These say nature could be an avatar of the God archetype or something like that. They can take these different forms. So something like that.
Except
in the
obviously
way
that carries dangers. But
Krishna is one, and Rama are embodiments of whatever Vishnu is.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very important to separate the symbol from the archetype. So where people often get confused in talking about archetypes is that they are thinking of a particular symbol, a particular form, and call that the archetype, rather than the function that the form, the symbolic form, fulfills for them. But the particular form is not going to be universal. So if you're looking for something that's adequately universal as far as we're aware in your understanding of archetypes, then it's got to go further than just the particular set of symbols that you happen to rely on in your cultural niche, as it were.
What about conflations and fusions between these archetypes, right? Because I was thinking of a character like Batman, who is a hero, but he's a hero in the form of making himself into a terrifying monster of the night. He's taking on the shadow. Is that the hero and the shadow merging, or how do those collaborations work?
I'm afraid I'm actually not very familiar with Batman as a story. I've never seen the film.
Anybody who thinks their heroism is going to take the form of becoming the terrible thing.
Right. Well, it can certainly integrate that with the terrible thing. They can take its power, as it were. So in the process, they could unite those functions, in the sense that they could help us to distinguish what is actually threatening from what isn't threatening, and at the same time be determined in our goals and keep persevering in our goals. But that's where it's an oddly positive function, I think, that the shadow can have for us, because although it's something we reject and is a threat to us, if we can be alerted by it to a possible threat, but then also have that level of reflection, we ask ourselves, is it really a threat? Then if we can distinguish between our projection of what is a threat and what actually isn't and what isn't, then we're starting to use it more effectively.
Is there a common root? Is there an archetype out of which they all come, or some hybrid fusion of all four, or is that not a useful way to think?
Well, I think that in some ways they all tend to evolve towards the God archetype, in that if you take any of the first three functions and push their functions, that is, by applying them in more and more different conditions, and then you tend to end up with a God archetype. So for example, with the hero, you might start off, the simple heroic narrative. The hero tries to achieve the goal, encounters difficulties, overcomes the difficulties, and gets to the goal, happy ending. But then the more complex that narrative gets, the more the goal shifts. It turns out that the goal is different when you get there, or you have to change the goal, or you find that the method you set out to achieve it is actually changes what the goal is, and so on. So in order to change your view of the goal, you then need to be open to new potentials. So you're getting closer and closer to the God archetype as you stretch your hero archetype, if you like. And I think that's often at its best what's going on with the archetypal role of Jesus and the Buddha, both of which sort of cross between the hero and God. So they're you've got a goal of some kind. Well, in the case of the life story of the Buddha sets out to reach this goal of enlightenment, which he gets or tries to get through going to two different teachers, and then also falling in with the 5 ascetics. But it doesn't work out like that. His initial understanding of what that means turns out to be wrong, so he has to completely re-examine what he's doing. and in the process find some middle way. So there's a big change, but to be open to that change, you need to remain inspired by an increasingly subtle sort of symbol of what it is you're aiming towards. So his presumably his symbol of enlightenment changes as he moves on, and we in our turn can be inspired by the story of that progression. So I think the same is true with being inspired by someone who's other than you, who's different, which is often somebody who's sexually other. Could be your partner. So your relationship with your partner might start off being very dependent on just a sexual relationship, but it might get broader and broader. You might be inspired in different ways to develop in yourself, and your recognition of threats may get broader and broader, so that in responding to your threats, you're actually developing yourself and engaging in new potentials. So any of those three can, in a way, become the God archetype simply by becoming more complex.
Right. So as they're getting broader and broader, as I'm realizing there's more to it, that's the action of the God archetype to some degree.
Yeah. I mean, not independently of us, of course, but it's us encountering the God archetype. Yeah.
We're doing the God archetype thing.
Yeah.
The God archetype is like, obviously all of these things have different contextual valences and they change and evolve, but it seems like there's a bit of an ambiguity around the God archetype for me, like around the difference between what's necessarily good and what's unknown potential. Between an experience I might have, I might go into a mode where everything really hangs together and there's just an overwhelming beatific orderliness to reality, versus I look at reality and I go, I don't know what the fuck's going on. This is all just mysterious to me, right? Are those really the same thing? Well,
I'm not sure that everything being necessarily good is quite what the God archetype is helping us with. I mean, I see that as more of a projection, really, an aspect of projecting the God archetype to make it easier to deal with. So that's a whole dimension of my book, is exploring the nature of projection, which is a kind of hijacking or derailing of the process of being inspired by the archetype, so that you're inspired by an easy version of it, if you like, which eventually takes away the function of the archetype as it might have helped you. So if you see God as very much as a kind of orderly legislator of the universe, and that's very likely to go with belief in God as a supernatural entity, which then gets you into absolute beliefs, projections, and so on, which
what about handling it in a subtler way? Like, what about, is there a difference between the mode of experience, however I encounter it or frame it to myself, that I might call divine, and the mode of experience I might call mysterious or ambiguous?
So, yeah, well, I'm not sure that those are different, except obviously there's an inspiration at work in the divine, which is in our relationship to what you might call the divine, the God archetype, which is not necessarily there in all cases of ambiguity. Ambiguity can just be ambiguity,
right?
But it's ambiguity with a certain energy being put into it, if you like, from us, in a certain relationship with us.
Okay. I'm thinking about an event just popped into my mind. I was at the Banff Hot Springs in the Rocky Mountains in North America. So I came out and there were some woods, and I walked down this hill, and there was this wonderful sort of, local indigenous cultural gathering going on. So I watched the dances, and then a guy came out and gave a little bit of a lecture in wonderful ceremonial regalia. But he held up this eagle feather and he said, the eagle feather is very important to my people. And I thought, exactly. And then he explained what he thought it represented. And I was like, oh, you lost me. Like, it sort of had deviated from this really visceral resonance moment that I think was obvious to everyone into some sort of intellectual connect the dots. Here's what it means in the encyclopedia.
Yeah.
And it makes me curious about, in relating to things like archetypes, is it more useful to be conscious of what we associate with them, or can that get in the way of our visceral use of these functions?
I think it's useful to be conscious of them to some degree without having to nail them down too specifically. I mean, Jung talked about the distinction between signs and symbols, which I think is important. So the example you give sounds like a symbol being reduced into a sign in the way that Jung would use those two terms. So a sign has a single fixed meaning, whereas a symbol always has an element of ambiguity. It means more than one thing. It's a set of associations as a lived relationship with that symbol. So I think in order to relate to the archetype, to use the archetype, as it were, we have to keep it living in some way or another. Whether that's obviously involves avoiding turning it into a sign, fixing it, allegorizing it, which often goes together with turning it into a set of beliefs. I mean, that's the distinction between meaning and belief, I think, is really important here, that archetypal symbols are meaning. You don't have to believe anything about them beyond what you might believe about their function for them to be helpful to you.
It seems like in a very practical sense, we don't have to decide whether these archetypes evolved or whether they're part of the ontology of the universe. But if they did evolve, that opens up interesting possibilities that they might have been different in the past, or there might have been a different number of them, and that they might be different in the future as adaptation to new circumstances. Do you think there could be a future for archetypes, like new archetypes that play a different role than we've seen so far in human history?
It's very difficult to tell, isn't it? Now, all I've done is sort of try to identify or analyze phenomenally what we experience as the inspiring functions of archetypes. I mean, there is one that I talk about as a kind of fifth function, which is, you could say, is on the edge, or might be a potential further way that the archetypes can evolve, and that's the middle way archetype, which I see as being a bit different from the God archetype because it's also grounded. So it symbolizes for us the tension between our ideals for open potential, that is the God archetype, together with our recognition of the conditions that we start with. So there's always this tension between the two, whereby we're working with what we've actually got, but moving towards something beyond that.
The notions like the hero's journey seem to propose a particular passage through these things, right? The hero encounters the shadow and follows the anima and things like this. How do you think of that when you think of these functions? Because the way you're describing it seems like all of these functions can always play some interesting, useful role in our lives. But is there a special orientation of passage through them to accomplish a particular task, like individuation or something like that?
I tend to see that in continuous incremental terms. So incrementality is an important part of my middle way philosophy. So that kind of frames my approach to this, that there's not any kind of final goal to the process, but there's a process of integration. Yeah. So the process of integration in relation to archetypes involves overcoming projection by basically putting our projections, our tendencies to take things literally, putting them in a bigger context in one way or another. So integrative practices do that, whether that's mindfulness or the arts or critical thinking, different levels at which that can be done. Integration, I think, is an ongoing process for us, but we can't see exactly where it's going, what the final destination is, except we'll have an archetypal symbol of it, and that's obviously what Buddhists mean by enlightenment. But I think it's important not to reduce that or project that archetypal symbol into an absolute belief.
I'm curious how important worldview might be here, right? Because it seems like, I mean, you could make the argument that if you imagine the world consists of solid, isolated individual things, that might make it much harder than if you had a middle way or even a sort of pagan notion where different powers can interpenetrate forms because forms aren't closed, right? Do some worldviews make it easier to productively work with archetypes than other worldviews do?
Well, I think worldviews that help you move from wherever you start towards greater complexity can play a transitional role. So like you see in the life story of the Buddha, which I talked about earlier, the Buddha has to leave the palace in order to go into the forest. But then the forest turns out to be limiting as well. So then he moves on from that. But I don't think there's any kind of final worldview which has all the answers. So which worldview might help you move on in some respects will depend on where you start. But in the larger perspective, I think it's important not to sort of latch on to a particular metaphysics or a particular worldview as the one that will help you practically, because what can help you practically always involves some kind of tension between approaches, some recognition of uncertainty, basically, about the beliefs you're holding provisionally to help you at the moment.
We might not be able to make absolute statements about which are better and worse worldviews, but there may be a better one for you for your next step.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about like processing, assimilating, and integrating archetypal functions. It seems like that has two modes, sort of like a healthy mode and an unhealthy mode, right? So in a great normal mode, we sensibly somehow interact with these archetypes, and there may be ways or skills or wisdom around doing that better. And then there's some dysfunctional mode. You're using the word projection, where people tend to over-concretize and latch on to some form or partial aspect of the archetype and get their energy stuck there. And so then there's a wisdom or a skill of unpacking that and reclaiming that energy. Maybe you could say something about both or either of those. How do we get better at using archetypes, and how do we avoid the pitfalls?
Okay. Well, I've already mentioned the process of integration. Yeah. So integration is a response to projection. But I think it's helpful to try and get your head around projection in the first place. So sure. to have a wide enough view, I think, of what's going on in projection. So I mean, I've got another book coming out on this, which is my next one, called Absolutization, which is all about this, the different dimensions of how we get stuck, basically. That's what causes conflicts and projection and dogma and so on. But so what I try and do in the book is look at projection from a variety of points of view and just show how archetypal projection can, for example, be bias, or it can be associated with power, or you can think of it neuroscientifically as an over-dominance of the left hemisphere in particular, particularly the prefrontal cortex of the left hemisphere. So that kind of linguistic representation that we might have at a particular point. So there are a variety of ways of understanding it, but those could just be our ways of helping to pin it down and contextualize it, because the not getting stuck in projection is always a matter, I think, of contextualizing it in some sense. So not being caught up in this assumption that we have the whole story, but giving ourselves a slightly bigger story. So
one of the things we can do is remember that and remind ourselves not to absolutize the stories we're telling. But what other sorts of things can we do in order to integrate? What does integration consist of? How could we help that along?
You talked about in your introduction about getting, and you said donkeys, although mules is the original picture, but getting your mules facing in the same direction. So yeah, that's my favorite symbol for integration is the two mules pictures. Yeah, if you think of the two mules trying to eat different bales of hay with a cord, a rope binding them together so that they can't actually do that, they're in competition with each other. They turn around and they recognize that what's problematic about their assumptions, this crucial moment of contextualization, recognition, and then they're then able to cooperate and work together to eat the hay, piles of hay in turn. So, yeah, I think that's the basic process of integration, and there's that can be done at a more immediate aesthetic level. So you can, for example, in mindfulness, you can at least temporarily have a wider sense of what's going on just because of the relaxation of your body and the bigger context in which you are having your thoughts and feelings. So they no longer become quite so overwhelming, and you're then better able to think in different, wider ways. But then there was a second level, so I call that the level of integration of desire, where you're dealing with immediate experiences of desires, if you like, and at least suspending the conflict that might be causing projection. But the next level will be a meaning, integration of meaning. And there I think you can think of the arts as a very good example of integrative practice using meaning. So if we use the imagination in any sense to give us access to new ways of thinking about things, or new ways of could be ways of conceptualizing or ways of symbolizing, whether we're creating or just appreciating what someone else has done, then it can give a bigger context to what we're able to think, give us new resources for thinking differently. So again, that can help us not to get caught up in projection, where our understanding of the goal, for example, becomes so overwhelming we can't think of anything else, or our understanding of the God archetype becomes so narrow that it's a guru who gives us all the answers, or anything like that. Yeah. So a bit of art could help to loosen up any of those kinds of stuckness. But then the third and probably most important in the end is the critical thinking level, or the integration of belief. So where you're actually critically examining the assumptions you were making. So there's some critical thinking skills, or skills which are at least traditionally associated with philosophy, but I think to some extent practiced in most academic disciplines, but are needed in all aspects of everyday life, well outside academia, I think. So this recognition that we're making certain assumptions, recognizing what they are, and seeing them in some way or another in a bigger context, that there could be other alternative assumptions we could make, and that can be applied in all sorts of ways, like how we interpret what somebody said, or what sources we regard as credible or as authoritative. So critical thinking has a wide range of aspects, but they're all, I think, in one way or another, they're about contextualizing our beliefs and seeing them in a bigger context, so that we're no longer again overwhelmed by this single obsessive belief, which could well be projection of an archetype.
So critical self-investigation, artistic expression that fleshes out and causes appreciation and complexification of the experience, and the ability to allow some kind of mutual recognition and alignment between different, possibly conflicting desires and impulses, and a general metacognitive larger space which allows all of these things to occur in a depressurizing fashion.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah,
it made me think of there's a thing that often goes through my mind is the notion of a bed of nails. versus one nail, right? If you were to lay down on one nail, it'll go right through you and kill you. But if you have a lot of nails, it distributes the tension, and then you're laying down comfortably, but even higher than you were before.
Yeah. Good.
Let's talk a little bit about your work on the middle way. What do you mean by that term? And obviously, most people are going to associate it with, Nagarjuna and the second turning of Buddhism, but you've been trying to generalize it, refine it, make it a little bit more abstract and a little bit more applicable to more domains of life.
Yeah. Okay. Well, obviously, the term is, or the use of the term is inspired by the Buddha in various ways, but I think the Buddhist account of it is really just is an example of the application of a wider principle that can be used, and to some extent can be found in lots of other places, actually. Though the only other place I found that he used explicitly is in Jung, but that was a very interesting discovery in Jung's Red Book, that he actually talks about the middle way in a way that I think is independent of Buddhism. Anyway, so basically what I mean by the middle way, and this is kind of the distillation of a long process, but it's the avoidance of absolutes, both negative and positive and negative. So, the Buddha's early life story, which I've already mentioned, is a very good symbol for it, in that the Buddha leaves one context which he's been absolutizing, which he's been assuming is the whole story, then goes into another one, seeking better set of answers, finds that what he's being offered there isn't the whole story either. So then at that point, having gone through this two-stage process, he identifies the middle way as the way forward. And the middle way there, what's crucial about it is that it builds on his own experience. So it's preceded by him remembering a childhood experience of jhana, of meditative absorption. And so he has to come back to recognizing his body and what his body is doing and the constraints it imposes on him and so on. But then also recognizing that he can find helpful beliefs from different sources, and that he needs to obviously engage in a critical process to work out for himself what is the most appropriate way of using what he's encountered. So there are elements of insight that you can see symbolized, whether that's historically true or not, nobody knows, but you can see symbolized there. And obviously that's got a lot of relationship with what's most helpful about the scientific method, the process of provisionally identifying one theory, but then hopefully, I think, in order to investigate scientifically in the most helpful way, if you find a problem with your theory, you don't just abandon all of it immediately. You modify it slightly. You don't just go from one extreme to the other. You don't just negate what you had before. You find exactly what the problem is and modify what you've got. In most cases, until it's so full of holes, you realize you've got to abandon it, which is what's been known as a paradigm shift. There are all sorts of different sources from which we can find traces of the middle way, I think. But crucial to it is particularly the recognition that negations can be as absolute as positive claims. I think people often neglect that point or misunderstand it. And that sort of mysterious, somewhat ambiguous middle between the absolutes is our working ground. It doesn't offer truths, it just offers a sort of zone that we can work in helpfully, whilst avoiding obvious pitfalls on either side.
I'll come back to that, but you mentioned the scientific method, and it reminded me that I heard you say somewhere that we might be able to scientifically test archetypes. Now, obviously not to pin you down, you might not have the specific details on this, but in principle, how might we test archetypes scientifically?
Well, recalling that what I mean by archetypes there is his functions, his diachronic schematic functions. So I think those could potentially be tested scientifically. Firstly, well, because what you would then be trying to measure is the relationship between the way in which certain symbols stimulate us or inspire us, and are the ways in which we are then inspired or changed. So you just need to be able to track that over a long enough period of time, really. So there have been lifetime studies in psychology. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do, but it has been attempted to try and track changes which take place in people's personalities over an entire lifetime. And so probably that kind of length of study will be required. And you would also need some kind of way of judging the effect that archetypal symbols have on people. And that's where I think the work of people like Agel Grossman can be really helpful. So he's been working on psychology of wisdom, trying to identify features of wisdom of a kind that might be sort of measurable enough for psychologists to be happy with. So I think that's the direction in which I would see it as being potentially testable, without me being anywhere near in a position to test it myself. That would be the lines of my suggestion. Yeah, that it's not just a speculation, and it shouldn't be. If we're dealing with something that's in experience, a scientific way of testing it should be possible. Not that I would expect any such testing to be conclusive, but it can give us further justification or further indication of strengths and weaknesses. It can be a further source of understanding about archetypes, potentially.
Coming back to the middle way, I mean, I'm intrigued by what you're saying, because one of the things I work on is this idea of the metaphysics of adjacency, which treats nearness as the most sort of more fundamental way of thinking than objects that might happen to be near each other, right? So we're thinking of a non-dual function, which is to be near something is not to be either identified with it or separate from it. Neither of those exactly apply in the space of nearness somehow, in the adjacencies. And so if we were to think of everything as being adjacent, then nothing is ever completely separated or completely identified. So it's a bit like taking 0 and 100% off the scale and only having the in-between space, which can shift around and be in different modes. So I like that part. I love the idea of this general middle that has these different qualities. But I know that sometimes when people think of the middle way, they think of a kind of like the exact middle, and this can lead to some problems, right? The one problem is the famous Overton window, where if I change your experience of the extremes, I can manipulate what you think is the middle compromise position. And the other problem is people who maybe get stuck trying to constantly be a well-balanced, moderate person who doesn't move toward any extreme experiences. So how do you think about conceiving the middle way to evade the sort of twin problems of manipulating the middle and getting addicted to moderate sensibilities?
Well, I think one needs to be clear that it's about avoiding absolutes. So and that involves being clear about what absolutes are. So quite often I find a fair amount of confusion of that. So when people object to the middle way, thinking it's some sort of moderate position, perhaps politically, for example, they're confusing a navigation between absolutes with something that happens to be conventionally or empirically in the middle in a particular context. But you can avoid absolutes and end up with something that seems to be the best response to the conditions, but seems quite extreme to someone who's not used to it, because they're not trying to engage with the same conditions in the same way. So for example, I'm a vegan, and certainly until recently, that seemed quite an extreme position to a lot of people because it's not very conventional, or hasn't been anyway. But to me, that just seems like the best way of engaging with the conditions, particularly of the environment and our relationship to the environment at the moment, and in relation to how we use animals in that environment. And I don't take it absolutely in the sense that I'm not worried about the purity of what passes through my mouth. But as a general principle, veganism seems like a very helpful principle to adopt. So it's not about, what might appear to be conventional, or what people, is not necessarily about what people regard as extreme, although it can fall out that way. What people regard as extreme may correspond to what's identifiably absolute, but in some other cases it might not. So I think we need to go through a process of thinking about why a position is absolute, or why we think it's absolute. And very often that involves the total rejection of an opposite, which is rejected, and particularly the complete ignoring of any third alternative. So the framing of the whole thing prevents people from thinking of any third alternative. So certainly the way people often think about mind and body, for example, or about theism and atheism, rules out any third alternative. And if you suggest one, then they'll just dismiss it. It doesn't appear on their charts, as it were. And that's quite a good sign of absolutization, as far as I'm concerned. It's where people just won't consider, they don't consider it feasible to talk in terms of a third alternative.
There seems to be a skill of thought, a kind of pluralism and unpacking and fluidity that's necessary cognitively. But it seems like there's a physiological element to this, right? Like a guy like Wilhelm Reich would argue that you're always going to have people thinking in absolute dichotomies as long as their bodies are locked down and armored and they can't move and breathe freely. They won't be able to think freely. They won't be able to consider other alternatives. Do you think about these, about our ability to adapt to middle way wisdom as having physiological affordances or physiological problems?
Oh, definitely there's a relationship there. I mean, it's not a very simple one-to-one relationship. And I wonder, I don't know that much about Reich, but I wonder if he ever simplified it, but I don't know for sure. But certainly people's tendency to think in absolute ways, I think, has correspondences in their bodies. The way in which people can become physically rigid in one way or another can correspond to how their mental states. And similarly, if you do any kind of mindfulness practice, you'll be aware of the relationship between your body and mindfulness in the body and awareness of the body and relaxing the body and the kinds of mental states you may get into.
One of the interesting things about this conversation, sort of cut you off a little bit there. I mean, I want to get back to whatever you were saying, but it just occurred to me that so many people think of God and the absolute as identical, and you're using them as almost opposites in terms of a locked down absolute quality versus an endlessly unknown potential.
Yeah. I mean, that's coming back to projection. That's the peculiar thing about projection. It's a sort of complete hijacking of a function that, in this case, opens up and turns it into something that's doing the opposite. It's fulfilling a particular, maybe it's a tool of power, effectively, when people start perhaps just not only believing in God, but also using it as a form of power, so that you can appeal to these absolute revelations or commands. That just seems to be how things have developed in a way that I mean, you were talking about evolution earlier, but you could see sort of waves of development possibly occurring there. That first we developed archetypal functions, which helped us to maintain our inspirations over time, but then possibly to somewhere around the Neolithic, when power structures began to become more important in society, those functions began to become hijacked, well, either by us as individuals or by socially in power structures that because they're so useful, to be able to take that open relationship with an archetype and turn it into something you can manipulate to make people do things. That's way too tempting not to make use of for somebody in a position of power. So it's in a way not surprising that archetypes got perverted into functions that are almost opposite of what they started out doing.
The question of exploitation of the archetypes interests me. There's Jordan Peterson has this argument that there was sort of a pantheon of archetypes, but over time tribes interacted with each other, and slowly the hero, and he's thinking of the capacities of the hand and the mouth, the sort of that became dominant because they realized that was the better archetype, and it gave us competence across multiple kinds of games we could play with each other, and that can become static and entrenched and problematic. But the myths themselves tell us that Horus has to replace Osiris, and so there's always a problem of the ossification of the old hero replaced by the new hero. So he has this idea that the myths themselves describe how to deal well with the archetypes and how they can self-regulate. But at the same time, it seems like myths could also lead us in the wrong direction and open us to all kinds of exploitation and manipulation through our archetypal functions.
Yeah, I mean, it all depends how they're interpreted and used, doesn't it? I mean, people sort of use myths for purposes of power all the time, and like Putin is currently using stories from the history of Russia and Ukraine in order to boost his approach. So it's just a common process with any story that you're kind of is common to try and identify tools of power from that story, but the story itself is just meaning. It just opens up possibilities for people, I think. So I wouldn't want to sort of condemn a myth itself, but we have to try and distinguish the myth just as a story from our interpretations of that story. Just like we need to distinguish religious experience from the beliefs we might draw from that experience or associate with that experience.
I'm curious about what I want to call somatic experience, the sense of the inside of the body, because that's one of the things that many people tend to get better at through various sorts of spiritual and religious practice. And it seems like it gives you a groundedness that would allow you to be more open to middle way options, because you don't get trapped so quickly in the absolutes and extremes. It also seems like it might provide an opportunity to recapture the energy of projections a little bit better. Because sometimes someone will have a problem or something, and another person will say, well, where do you feel that in your body? Right. So maybe that I'm projecting a whole bunch of energy onto some version of an archetype or some situation. And if I were to feel in my body where I was actually generating that energy, I've already taken a big step toward reclaiming it from that specific image.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a question, but
yeah,
if you could say anything about that, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree that there are very likely to be relationships between the bodily state and the ideas, and as we said earlier, that absolutizations can get locked up physically, as it were, and our muscles can express that rigidity and so on. But I'd be wary of being too specific about what locks with what. So I can see a temptation to produce elaborate theories about that are based on sort of limited evidence.
Right. That one's operating through my third chakra. I have a friend who is very involved in political struggle and also very involved in Tai Chi. And he wanted me to ask you what the middle way tells us about how to engage in fight and how to engage in struggle, how to approach that in a way that's sort of sane but also effective, right? Because there are historically kinds of middle way approaches to martial arts and things like that.
Well, I mean, I see the middle way as the other side of integration, really. So integration and the middle way are basically the same thing. They require each other. So by avoiding absolutization, we're able to use energies from different sources that are previously in conflict with each other and get them to work together. So the middle way is I would say, is crucial to any form of mediation. I mean, you can look at different mediation techniques, for example, and you can see the middle way working in one way or another to get people to examine absolute assumptions that they're making in one way or another. And different forms of mediation just do that in slightly different ways. But in terms of, well, most broadly, I suppose, how we can address conflict, if what we mean is socio-political conflict, then obviously there are well-worn direct ways of trying to deal with that, whether it's through diplomacy or whatever. But often that involves re-examining assumptions that we're making, where we made absolute assumptions, for example, about the other side and their motives. That's like common ones. But that also depends on our individual practice. And so the conflict we have with someone else or with another group is also a conflict with an image within ourselves of that group or that person. So in order to be able to resolve that conflict externally, we also need to resolve it simultaneously internally. And I don't think there's a necessary priority there. You don't have to say you have to do it internally in order to do it externally, or vice versa. It's just that the two are interdependent. And if we wholly neglect one or the other, then we're likely to miss something or to get stuck in a way we didn't anticipate. So yeah, well, these socio-political peace efforts they do often appear to get stuck just because people are locked in certain sets of absolute beliefs that they won't re-examine. So it's then intractable unless people are working more at an individual level as well. So I think the middle way hopefully has a lot to contribute as a perspective to our understanding of what's going on in any kind of conflict and how to respond to it. And it's not something new it's not a new technique, as it were, for resolving conflict, but it's a way of understanding the relationship between what's already being done and how it can work.
Why are you writing this new book about absolutes? What's exciting you about it, where you thought this has to be a book?
Well, there's quite a long story there. Basically, I suppose that the last few books that I've written have been trying to engage with specific audiences about the middle way. So I've written books about Buddhism, about Christianity, and broadly Jungian. So this latest book we've been talking about is obviously to do with the legacy of Jung and my engagement with it. But my longer term project for the last 20 years or so has been middle way philosophy. And basically that's gone through various phases of evolution. So it started off as a PhD thesis back in 2001. And then it became a multi-volume self-published book around 2012 to 2015. But then now I've got the opportunity to publish it with Equinox, basically. So, and was also realizing that a completely new better articulation was needed. Given the how demanding the whole thing is, it needs to continue to evolve really and improve. So this new multi-volume series with Equinox is going to be looking at different aspects of the middle way, and the first volume thus is trying to examine the problem that the middle way tries to fix, as it were. So I mean, in Buddhist terms, it will be the first and second noble truths, sort of identifying what the problem is before you try and fix it, as it were. But also what the reason I felt a book on absolutization is needed is just because there's so many sort of partial views of it, which are all very well in themselves, but they're not synthesized. I've never come across them really being synthesized. So there's philosophical arguments about metaphysics, for example, There are psychological arguments about bias and about conflict. There's all kinds of, there's stuff in Buddhism about obsessive desire and samsara and proliferation or propension, or a tendency to go round and round or ruminate. Yeah, so all of these are, and in systems theory, there's the reinforcing feedback loops, which you can also apply psychologically. So there's lots of different interacting ways of understanding what I would call absolutization, but I've never seen them brought together satisfactorily. So really, I needed to do it myself. Yeah, obviously, part of the issue there is that people working in different disciplines tend to think they've got the whole story, but they're just feeling different bits of the elephant, which someone else has felt in a different context.
Absolutization seems, on the one hand, like an ancient perennial human problem. But I know there must be people who make the argument that our current political and economic and particular media setup encourages people into hasty, rash, hyperbolic, absolutizing judgments. Is the problem the same as it always been? Are we making any progress? Is it getting worse? What's the state of absolutization today?
I think it's the same as it always been, but there are obviously new ways it's being spread or communicated. So yeah, the echo chamber effect in social media tends to create reinforcing feedback loops of people just circulating and recirculating the same absolute assumptions without any further examination. So that's a new kind of expression of the problem. And then you've got political figures manipulating that phenomenon, and hence we get political phenomena like Putin's war on Ukraine and Trump and Brexit, all of which seem to be in various ways attributable to this phenomenon in changes in communication. So just at the point where you might think, well, the world was getting wonderfully complex, we had all these very sophisticated ways of addressing all our problems, apart from climate change maybe, but yeah, we're running into a whole new crop, a whole new set of expressions of absolutization, you could say. Yeah. So I don't think it's a new problem, but certainly then it takes new forms as we go on.
Do you have a regular personal, spiritual, existential, internal practice of some kind? And is that an extension of or informed by your middle way insights?
Well, certainly it's all part of the same bundle as far as I'm concerned. So if I wasn't trying to practice personally, then there'd be no point in or at least it would certainly undermine the philosophy that I'm writing. But also writing the philosophy and clarifying it is part of the practice for me. So, but yeah, some kind of mindfulness practice is important for me. The arts are incredibly important, but particularly for me, that's classical piano and playing classical piano. And but I engage with all the arts, really, all the major ones. Critical thinking, well, I have kind of a long history as a philosophy critical thinking teacher, so that's been important to me in the past, and engaging with philosophy in various ways. So yeah, that's also a practice, I suppose, and to some extent my engaging with other people in discussion, which could be broadly described as philosophical. That's another aspect of practice, and trying to do that in a helpful middle way fashion.
Is there anything else I haven't asked you about that I should have? What would you like to talk about, Robert?
Well, we've had quite a wide-ranging discussion, haven't we? Yeah. I mean, probably it'll be good to talk to you again at some point about the absolutization book when it comes out, if you wish.
Yeah, absolutely. We would love that. And this has been a very I think rich conversation. I appreciate your attempt to answer all of my peculiar questions. And it's been nice getting to know you. Thanks very much, Robert.
Thank you. Great to get to know you as well.